Angel Cane is the name, and I served on the Danville train till Stoneman's cavalry came and tore up the tracks again. In the winter of '65, we were hungry, just barely alive. I took the train to Richmond at Fair. It was a time I remember oh so well. The night they drove old Dixie down, and all the bells were ringing. The night they drove old Dixie down, and all the people were singing. They were la 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 la. Back with my wife in Tennessee, one day she came to me. Virgil, Lord, come see, there goes the Robert E. Lee. Well, I don't mind chopping wood, and I don't care if the money's no good. But you take what you need, leave the rest. They should never have taken the very best. The night they drove old Dixie down, and all the bells were ringing. The night they drove old Dixie down, all the people were singing. They went la 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 la. Like my father before me, I am a working man. Like my brother above me, I took a rebel stand. He was just 18, proud and brave, but a Yankee laid him in his grave. I swear by the blood beneath my feet, you can't raise a king back up when he's in defeat.
this is not a live stream, so I want you guys to please upvote this, and we're going to talk today about basically the second part of, just a two-part series that I did for our news network about efforts to reform the Democratic Party. Now, the first part I think I covered about a week and a half ago, if not longer, and it concerned the Democratic Party since the 40s, from the 40s until about 1972, all the different candidates that tried to kind of move it, usually further to the left, and then they ended up, party corruption kind of got in the way. Not that I would support a left-wing candidate. I'm just telling the story as it was. So it goes from Henry A. Wallace in 1944 and 48 up until 1972. There was George McGovern. So this is Wallace, and then you go through several iterations of different people who tried to change it. This is George McGovern. And then my second part, which I published yesterday night, or technically this morning, includes a lot of candidates from basically Frank Church, who's one of the politicians that I most admire in U.S. history, up until Bernie Sanders. So people should understand the Democratic Party has had historically a lot of issues with, basically transparency and keeping people like to joke that 2016 was when the Democratic Party was shown for what it really is, an undemocratic movement. But the reality is that a lot of this stuff was evident years and years and years ago. Okay, once again, I think you couldn't see the screen before. So Henry A. Wallace probably have been president in 1944 when, or was it 45, when Franklin Roosevelt died. He was his vice president until 1944. And then he was replaced by Harry S. Truman. And a lot of people on the progressive left try to say, well, it was a plot done by the corporate Democrats to replace Henry A. Wallace and reverse the New Deal. Well, I would agree that Henry A. Wallace would have probably taken Roosevelt's socialist tendencies all the way to the logical extreme. But it's not as if Harry S. Truman reversed the New Deal. It was kind of, Harry S. Truman was definitely milder than Franklin D. Roosevelt. But people exaggerate when they say that he was some sort of a right-winger or something. Then, of course, there were a lot of different iterations until then. And then you get to George McGovern, who was like a real, he was a real departure from the previous Democratic candidates like Hubert Humphrey. He was like actually calling for ending the war in Vietnam, unlike a lot of his contemporaries in the party that were saying, well, no, we have to stay the course, and this is radicalism and hippies or whatever. I get it that a lot of the people who opposed the war in the 60s and 70s were hippies, but it doesn't make you a hippie to oppose the war. It's kind of a guilt by association thing. And of course there was a lot of counterculture support for McGovern. But what are you going to do? He can't just give up a position because other people that are kind of distasteful to you also happen to support it. So, by the way, the music selection I did for today, I had to pick Sophie Hawkins' version of The Night They Drove Dixie Down, because the other versions that I've heard before by the band and by Joan Baez are blocked by YouTube if you rebroadcast them. So this video would have been blocked like automatically, I think. So I mean, her version is okay, but there's nothing like the original, the band version, and Joan Baez has like a really nice version as well. So anyway, today we're going to deal a little more with the efforts since 1976. And this all stems, like I said the previous time, from a conversation I had with Jim Boydston and Josephine Perulli about 2 weeks ago, when they were on talking about the issue with John Mattis and about their reaction to the way the Democratic Party is going today. And Josephine actually brought up all of the different efforts to reform the Democratic Party from within in the past 30 to 40 years. And I would say that some of these were not as easy to find because the material just isn't there. It's not archived very well. But there were a few that were pretty well. You could look at them, and there were some other ones that I found that were also interesting that weren't included. So you have Frank Church in 1976 did run for president. He was a senator from Idaho. He's one of the few Democrats that I think I admire, because he did try to audit the CIA and find out exactly what the hell they were doing. They were organizing assassinations all around the globe. They were unaccountable. Um, they exposed exactly what happened. Well, not exactly what happened, but a lot of the details of what happened during the 1953 Mossadegh coup in Iran, as well as what happened in Chile and what had been happening in Central America. I believe in Guatemala there was a coup also in 1953. So what really is that the issue here is whether our parties, whether our political leaders, our political elected officials have a real handle on what the executive branch of government is doing, because the CIA is accountable both to the executive and the legislative branch. They don't really are. I mean, I don't think the Supreme Court necessarily oversees the CIA very much, but a lot of them had been willing to look the other way as the CIA just became increasingly unaccountable. They were surveilling people overseas and getting the U.S. involved in all sorts of crap that, let's put it honestly. I mean, some of these areas that they were getting involved in weren't necessarily germane or relevant to the Cold War at all. With Iran, they probably could have come to some sort of that the U.S. I'm saying could have probably come to some sort of understanding with Mossadegh, even though he was a pretty leftist leader. They could have probably said to him, "Look, we'll respect your space as long as you don't become a Soviet satellite state." What did they do instead? They overthrew him and put the Shah in power, and the Shah helped pave the way for the Iranian Revolution later. So Frank Church was speaking out against the lack of accountability in the CIA, and for that he basically he became ignored. I mean, he won a few primaries in 1976 running for the nomination to battle against Gerald Ford in the general, and he won all these blue states over here: Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Utah, and Nebraska. So this was not a far left candidate. He was just calling for the CIA to be more accountable. He was also a very firm environmentalist, and I happen to also think that that's one of the few areas where the Democratic Party is a little better than the Republicans, even though a lot of it's like strongly on the legal, do the fuck what I'm telling you part of it. But Frank Church, I think, was a great candidate, and unfortunately, he didn't get very far because Jimmy Carter got nominated instead. And the way that Jimmy Carter ran the country was he basically would try hard to appear to be honest, but in reality, he really did have like a very poor decision making ability, and that showed because his national security advisors. His national security advisor was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a really hardcore neocon. He was probably the original neocon of all of them. This Polish expat who was so committed to getting the U.S. into a war with Russia that he torpedoed nuclear negotiations with the Soviets that were being undertaken by the Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. So Brzezinski was a complete disaster as an advisor to President Carter, and essentially by the end of Carter's term, relations with the Soviet Union was still doing much better than the Americans in a lot of aspects of the Cold War. They were gaining adherence. Of course, they were coming off of the victory in Vietnam and the rest of Indochina. So we were losing the war against communism in the late 70s, if you want to put it that way. There was a lot of social rot in the USA as well in the late 1970s because New York City was going through, there had been like a police strike and stuff like that. So if you were surveying the United States and compared to the rest of the world in the late 1970s, you could make the argument that the Soviets were winning the Cold War because there was the U.S. was just retreating everywhere there, whether it was in Africa with the Angola and Mozambique and all those countries, whether it was in Asia, whether it was with Iran, which is in Southwest Asia more so. So President Carter was a disaster of a president, and people knew that, and that's why in 1980. Well, first of all, let me show you a clip of Frank Church talking about the intelligence gathering issue.
Well, Senator, let me follow up by asking, do you think that the CIA and military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the Federal Preparedness Agency it's called now, to have contingency plans which threaten the liberty of American citizens?
Mr. Rowan, in due course, the committee will pass judgment on those questions. I'm not going to pre-guess the committee or prematurely attempt to pass judgment on this program. But let me tell you this. In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea. They could be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now, that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left, such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. Now, why is this investigation important? I'll tell you why. Because I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return.
Now, I don't know about you, but this is This was like, whatever party you support, this goes beyond parties. That's exactly the way I think about the intelligence agencies. And I wish Senator Church, this all happened before I was born. I wish somebody like him had been elected president, and not like the buffoons that came after him, like President Carter. President Reagan, for instance, did not really emphasize making the intelligence communities more accountable. Well, what are you going to do? He was elected on a totally different brief. What did we get? Iran Contra and a lot of other things. And people remember Reagan very fondly, But if it was not for that type of behavior and that type of abuse during the Cold War, we might not be where we are today. Now, we still had to have won the Cold War, but you see where exactly what he was talking about back then in 1975 during the Cold War. Well, that's the way the intelligence agencies behave today in the U.S. They believe that they are not accountable to the actual constituents of this country because they're not. It's like they've been completely separated from the processes of being accountable to anybody, whether it's the government or whether it's the voters or whether it's the media. So instead you had Carter, and this was his speech from. I don't know if we're going to watch the whole thing. I think this is a little long, and we have a lot of other stuff to get to. So in 1980, he was starting to make like statements showing that he knew that the people were against kind of his wishy-washy leadership, but he didn't really know how to actually communicate with people. So this is this crisis of confidence speech.
Good evening. This is a special night for me. Exactly 3 years ago, on July 15th, 1976, I accepted the nomination of my party to run for President of the United States. I promised you a president who is not isolated from the people, who feels your pain and who shares your dreams, and who draws his strength and his wisdom from you. During the past 3 years, I've spoken to you on many occasions about national concerns, the energy crisis, reorganizing the government, our nation's economy, and issues of war, and especially peace. But over those years, the subjects of the speeches, the talks, and the press conferences have become increasingly narrow, focused more and more on what the isolated world of Washington thinks is important. Gradually, you've heard more and more about what the government thinks, or what the government should be doing, and less about our nation's hopes, our dreams, and our vision of the future. 10 days ago, I had planned to speak to you again about a very important subject, energy. For the 5th time, I would have described the urgency of the problem and laid out a series of legislative recommendations to the Congress. But as I was preparing to speak, I began to ask myself the same question that I now know has been troubling many of you. Why have we not been able to get together as a nation to resolve our serious energy problem? It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. And I realize more than ever that as president, I need your help. So I decided to reach out and to listen to the voices of America. I invited to Camp David people from almost every segment of our society, business and labor, teachers and preachers, governors, mayors, and private citizens. And then I left Camp David to listen to other Americans, men and women like you. It has been an extraordinary 10 days. And I want to share with you what I've heard. First of all, I got a lot of personal advice. Let me quote a few of the typical comments that I wrote down. This from a Southern governor. Mr. President, you're not leading this nation. You're just managing the government. You don't see the people enough anymore. Some of your cabinet members don't seem loyal. There is not enough discipline among your disciples. talk to us about politics or the mechanics of government, but about an understanding of our common good. Mr. President, we're in trouble. Talk to us about blood and sweat and tears. If you lead, Mr. President, we will follow. Many people talked about themselves and about the condition of our nation. This from a young woman in Pennsylvania. I feel so far from government. I feel like ordinary people are excluded from political power. And this from a young Chicano. Some of us have suffered from recession all our lives. Some people have wasted energy, but others haven't had anything to waste. And this from a religious leader. No material shortage can touch the important things, like God's love for us, or our love for one another.
So yeah, that wasn't the entire speech, but a lot of people interpreted it as the Malaise speech, even though he never said the word Malaise. And I think Carter was trying to kind of get a handle over what he really wanted to do with the country, but in reality, what he ended up doing was handing a lot of momentum to his opponents, because you could hear from some of those people that government is distant from them, that the government it's not responsive to them. Government was kind of secluded from the American people and wasn't really including them on any decisions. And that's precisely what Reagan was proposing when he ran for president. Now, I think Reagan kind of didn't follow through on everything he said, because the government continued to grow even under him. Maybe not as much as it did under other presidents. And, this is exactly why Carter is considered one of the more failed presidents in history. He was, he was kind of the good person who didn't really know how to follow through on what he wanted to do. And then he got primaried by Ted Kennedy, who I mentioned in my Chappaquiddick review a couple of weeks ago. So Kennedy, he launches a challenge to President Carter, like an internal Democratic Party primary challenge to a sitting president, which probably was not the most expected thing to happen. And he kind of shot himself in the foot as well. But he was considered the progressive alternative in 1980. So let's hear his interview on why he wanted to be president.
On November 4th, 1979, CBS television suspended its evening lineup to broadcast an hour-long profile of Ted Kennedy. The senator had spent 17 years building a formidable career in the Senate, and it was widely anticipated that he would announce he was running for president. A grassroots Draft Kennedy movement helped convince the senator that he could beat the incumbent Jimmy Carter. CBS journalist Roger Mudd was granted unprecedented access to the senator. The 1979 broadcast is best remembered for Kennedy's rambling answer to a now famous question.
How did you phrase the question?
Why do you want to be president? That was it. That's all I said.
Why do you want to be president?
Well, were I to make the announcement and to run, the reasons that I would run is because I have a great belief in this country that there's more natural resources than any nation of the world.
It was almost a parody of a politician's answer.
I'd worked with Ted in every kind of area. I noticed if he didn't want to talk about something, he would talk using words, but they didn't come together somehow.
That brings a sense of restoration in this country by its people.
When I heard Roger Mudd ask Kennedy Kennedy, that the question, why do you want to be president, and Kennedy froze, I wrote and thought, that's right, he doesn't want to be president.
I'm surprised when I go back and look at it now that it occasioned the reaction that it did.
Kennedy's advisor at the time, Bob Shrum, downplays the significance of the interview.
He wasn't going to announce on television to Roger Mudd that he was running for president.
I think there's always been a question with Ted Kennedy, whether he really wanted to do what he was doing. Was he driven into it by the sense of his family and his two brothers' deaths, and he was sort of going through the motions and figuring he had to do it, maybe not even figuring, but just it happening. It was something that was happening to him, and it had to be.
It's imperative for this country to either move forward, that it can't stand still, or otherwise it moves backward.
Sorry, that was kind of a cliched line that he used. It either has to move forward, it can't stand still, or it will move backward. Well, instead Ronald Reagan destroyed Jimmy Carter. You can see here I included electoral maps on all of them. I also went back and edited the previous one and included electoral maps. These are from the primaries, of all of them. And Carter just beat Kennedy almost everywhere, besides the eastern states, here in the New York, Pennsylvania, Jersey, southern New England, as well as California, Arizona. The fact is that Carter was still able to pull out a victory in virtually most of the country, and Kennedy was rejected. So then Reagan comes in, and he of course was much more of a success than Carter in many respects. So in '84, Jesse Jackson threw his foot in he threw his hat in. I don't think you throw your foot in. He threw his hat into the ring and challenged Reagan and was running for the Democratic nomination. Here's some of his speech. I'm not going to play the whole thing. It's a little long. From Tenley Baptist Church.
8 Democrats running for the nomination. This time around, you got a chance and you got a choice. You want somebody who marched for you to get the right to vote. You got a choice. You want somebody who challenged corporate America to hire you and give you contracts. You got a choice. It's choice time. All this talk about qualification. What do blacks know about foreign policy? It's an insult. I was 3 years old. I came into my consciousness. My daddy was coming home from the war. Foreign policy. If he was so dumb, how'd he get over there and get back? If he didn't know foreign policy, why'd they give him a gun? And when they gave it to him, he knew which way to shoot. We know foreign policy. When you buy Honda and Toyota, that's foreign policy. That's right. Russian vodka, that's foreign policy. Panasonic and Sony, that's foreign policy. Mercedes-Benz, that's foreign policy. As a matter of fact, we came here on a foreign policy.
So Jackson was running, and he was using a lot of racial terms and trying to fire up a lot of the people. Well, especially among the black community, obviously. Now he did go after the labor vote as well. He was criticizing also the Chrysler bailout, claiming that it was done very incorrectly and that the corporation was not accountable. But the fact is that the Chrysler bailout of the 80s, even though you could, and I probably would have been against it at the time, Chrysler did pay the money back. Lee Iacocca did pay the money back. So, it's all well and good, and it's very populist. But Jesse Jackson, in my opinion, is not just, you could talk about Ted Kennedy being a corrupt candidate. Jesse Jackson probably makes Ted Kennedy look like an angel. I read this book a long, long time ago. It's called Shakedown. And it talks a lot about how Jackson was essentially, he bought his place at the top of the civil rights movement by kind of muscling in on Dr. Martin Luther King's operation. In reality, King's chosen successor was Ralph Abernethy, and Abernethy never really reached the public fame of either King or Jackson, because he was a little more of an organizer and behind the scenes type of person. And instead, you have Jackson, who would organize these quote unquote boycotts and economic campaigns, when in reality all he was doing was shaking down businesses. And eventually he got into corporate America and started shaking them down, forcing them to donate to his group, Operation Push, and later the Rainbow Coalition, which he formed. And that's the first so-called reform movement within the Democratic Party that we're discussing. But in reality, the Rainbow Coalition did not accomplish much. After Jackson lost in 1988, you can see here that he won a significant number of states in 1988. It's all these blue states, which includes, by the way, Alaska and Michigan, and Virginia and Delaware. So that it showed that he was not only strong in the South, where he really gave Al Gore at the time a run for his money, but he was also strong on a national level. And some would ask, well, why didn't he run again? Well, the answer is that, I think that Jesse Jackson eventually realized that his populist social message it could be used more to gain access and favors from corporate America than it could be to actually help people's lives. And by the way, Jesse Jackson, it's in this book as well, Shakedown by Kenneth Timmerman. Jesse Jackson was always connected to shadowy underworld figures in Chicago, the Black Pea Stone Nation, if you know who they are, with Jeff Fort, and his brother Noah, I think his name was Noah G. Robinson, Jesse Jackson's half-brother, who was a convicted felon and went to jail several times for all sorts of different financial crimes. So Jesse Jackson is just the first of these reformist leaders to have completely failed at changing the Democratic Party. And eventually, you see, he becomes a part of the Clinton establishment. He becomes Clinton's spiritual advisor, even though he himself, this was during the Lewinsky affair. Clinton was like, yeah, I'm taking counseling from Jesse Jackson. I think 2 years later, they discovered Jackson was having an affair of his own as a so-called reverend. He was knocking up his personal assistant, Karen Stanford. So that's life. What are you going to do about it? And then you have Jerry Brown's We the People. So he ended up, he lost in 1992. Here's a nice clip of him fighting with Bill Clinton.
Does the question, Governor Brown, of Mr. Clinton's recent problems lead you to believe that he has an electability problem?
Yeah, I think he's got a big electability problem.
Well, what do you think it is?
I want to tell you what it is. It was right in the front of the Washington Post today. He is funneling money to his wife's law firm for state business. That's number one. Number two, his wife's law firm is representing clients before the state of Arkansas agencies, his appointees. And one of the key is the poultry industry, which his wife's law firm represents. And to read the local Chicago Tribune, there's 270 miles of Arkansas rivers that are polluted with fecal coliform bacteria and are unsafe for humans or fish. So it's not only corruption, it's an environmental disaster, and it's the kind of conflict of interest that is incompatible in the kind of public servant we expect from a president of the United States.
It doesn't sound like you could run as his vice president.
No, it doesn't.
Mr. Clinton, do you want to take a swing at all that stuff?
I feel sorry for Jerry Brown. I served with him as governor in the late 70s. He asked me to support him for president once.
Did you?
Of course not. He reinvents himself every year or two. In 1990, he was pleading with the courts in California not to impose any limits on contributions. His law firm took $178,000 of taxpayers' money to beat a contribution limit initiative in 1990. And so I don't think you can take much of what he says seriously. Now, let me tell you this.
Well, can I just interject something? I mean, this guy just accused you of having somebody funnel legal fees to your wife and the poultry and whatever all that.
Well, his wife's law firm. It's in the Washington Post this morning.
Is it true or isn't it true, Governor Clinton?
Wait a second, Bill. You're always trying to attack.
Brown,
you never answer the question.
Mr. Brown, let him answer.
Let me tell you something, Jerry. I don't care what you say about me. I knew when Pat Caddell told me what you were going to say, that you were going to reinvent yourself and you were going to be somebody else's mouthpiece, you would say anything. But you ought to be ashamed of yourself for jumping on my wife. You're not worth being on the same platform as my wife.
I'll tell you something, Mr. Clinton. Now, don't try to escape it. Ralph Nader called me this afternoon. He read me the article from the Washington Post.
Does that make it true?
I was shocked by it. I was shocked by it because I don't think someone in government should be funneling money into his wife's law firm.
Governor Clinton, you were poking your finger at him. He poked it back. It's your turn, Governor
Jerry
Clinton.
comes here with his family wealth and his $1,500 suit and makes a lying accusation about my wife.
The Washington Post.
That doesn't make it true.
Are you saying they lied?
I'm saying that I never funneled any money to my wife's law firm. Never.
Well, they got $115,000 in bond business from the state of Arkansas, and you told just the other day that when people lose their jobs, you know who they are. You certainly knew people in your own administration who were giving out $115,000.
This nation is trying to elect a president. This nation's trying to elect a president.
That's right.
You carry on personally.
I think this is a critical issue.
Let me answer this.
I obviously do.
The issue is, every time I've ever run for office, because I have been a change agent, because I have worried about the problems of ordinary people, because I have given the kinds of programs that will change the lives of people. The people who run against me attack me personally. I have not attacked Jerry Brown personally. I have not attacked Paul Tsongas personally. I have not said anything about their character or their history. They have done that to me. That's what everybody I've ever run against has always done. And guess what? I win because I stand up for ordinary people and real change. And it is a crying shame that because they read the polls in the Chicago papers today, I get this kind of criticism. My wife is a fine person who has not done anything unethical. She has given tens of thousands of free dollars worth of free time to serving our state, to doing free work for the state. There's no telling what all she's done. Now, let me finish. That has nothing to do with the electability issue. In terms of my electability, I have been attacked repeatedly over years and years and years, and none of it's ever stuck with my people who are discriminating because they know that I am a change agent. The only way we can win this election is with somebody who's tough enough to stand up to the kind of garbage the Republicans throw at you, the kind of personal attacks that I've been subject to in the last few days.
Get off that
Yeah, so that was a very interesting segment. I think that everything that Jerry Brown said about Bill Clinton has turned out to be true. But Bill Clinton was, I mean, it shows there exactly how strong of a candidate he was, because he really, you know, as much as Jerry Brown would try to get all these charges to stick, Clinton really just fought back and made him look like he was a pussy. So the fact is that Jerry Brown ran for president 3 times, 1976, 1980, and 1992. And, you know, he won in 1992. He won, let's see here, 4 or 5 states, 6 states maybe, against Clinton. And I would say that, you know, he's tried several times to reinvent himself, just like Clinton was saying. But it never really seems to create like a coherent character, such that, I mean, when he came back to politics, he served as governor in the 70s and 80s. I think he was elected in 1974, served until 1982 as governor, then went on a break, came back, and became head of the California Democratic Party, then runs for president again in 92. Then he takes another break, starts a radio show, starts We the People, another political action committee that would get money out of politics and change the way that the Democratic Party operates. Doesn't do that. Ends up running for mayor of Oakland, serves 8 years as mayor of Oakland, then runs for attorney general of California, serves 4 years over there, flips on the death penalty, right? So he states that he's against the death penalty, but then he kind of acts as attorney general. He works to reinstate it. Then he gets elected governor again, and it's, you know, California is just a dump now. You know, no offense to those of you that live there, but it is. because of people like Jerry Brown. So that was the next stop. And then of course, you have Kucinich and Sharpton and Howard Dean in 2004. And Howard Dean was really he was this Vermont governor who was an anti-war guy during the early Iraq War. And I thought he did have a chance of winning. I remember him winning that primary, and I was like, wow, this would really be weird if he became president. Even though he seemed like a complete idiot when he really asked him a lot of questions. But, he did have that populist flavor that was needed for the Democrats at the time.
Throughout the history of presidential elections, certain inspiring moments have propelled candidates to victory. These are not those moments. It's a long road to the White House. Don't screw it up.
If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa, we would have given anything for that. Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. We're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
The difference between just an incidental gaffe and one that really can bring down a campaign is if that gaffe somehow speaks to something that the public and the media are suspicious of about that character. So, for example, Howard Dean, he's kind of a high-strung guy, and his opponents in the race were kind of whispering, this guy cannot be trusted. He's not going to be a cool commander-in-chief. This guy's going to have his finger on the atomic bomb button, right? So when he kind of has that explosion of the Dean scream, it played into the narrative that was already just waiting to be exposed by the media.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
If Howard Dean were running for the 2016 elections, and he would have done that exact same speech, the exact same way, under the exact same conditions, I don't think anybody would have paid any attention to it whatsoever. Howard Dean has got to be sitting at home and watching every single night some of the things that these candidates are saying. And he's got to wonder at the unfairness of the universe that he was born just a little bit too early.
Yeah, that was the Dean scream. So, yeah, Howard Dean was the only one of those anti-war candidates that won a state. He was a progressive. He's kind of drifted further to the side of the Democratic establishment since then. And Dennis Kucinich, who comes from he actually comes from, my county, also was a real pro or rather anti-war candidate at the time, as was Al Sharpton, who is, let's be honest, just a cheaper version of Jesse Jackson, and actually much less intelligent than Jesse Jackson, and also a corporate sellout. But in any case, so Kucinich and Dean both ran in 2004 for president, and Al Sharpton as well. Then in 2008, Kucinich ran again. But they never really made any headway because the Democratic Party by that time had been insulated from anti-war and also reformist voices. So essentially, of course, Obama gets elected in 2008. And then there's the Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution thing. So what am I trying to say here? Now, why did Bernie Sanders have such a popularity during the 2016 election? Now, there's a lot of reasons. I'm not going to cover all of them here. But among them was the fact that Obama had betrayed them with regards to the Affordable Care Act, which wasn't really what progressives were looking for. He also appointed Robert Gates as Secretary of Defense. That was a Bush holdover. So he wasn't really departing from the Bush administration's policies as far as the Iraq War as much as progressives wanted them. They wanted him to pretty much pull the troops out of Iraq. That didn't really happen until a few years later. Of course, he got involved in a number of other wars. Then he also appointed Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, which a lot of progressives also hated. He appointed two really crazy corporate shills, Penny Pritzker at the Department of Commerce, who's part of a major banking family in Illinois, as well as Tim Geithner at the Treasury. So these are people, that progressives looked at and they're like, this isn't the candidate that we wanted in President Obama. So then they started looking at Senator Sanders, who was dramatically further to the left than Obama. And eventually he ended up winning a number of states. And of course, there's all the policies, universal health care, support for GMO food labeling, ban on fracking, a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants. Yes, I'm going to say illegal immigrants. I don't care what you think. A workers' right agenda that robustly defends unions and worker co-ops, opposition to the TPP and other trade deals, as well as demanding to renegotiate NAFTA in order to prevent the loss of manufacturing jobs. Bernie Sanders really did, you could like him, you could hate him. I happen to hate him, but he did have a great consistency in terms of policy, whereas other candidates would kind of pussyfoot around and say, I'm going to support, just what's good for the American people. Don't really talk about what they really want. And Bernie Sanders did. So he won a lot of these states that would have, many would have thought were not really going to be won by him or by anybody on the Democratic side. He just did remarkably well in the Midwest, in Indiana, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And yeah, I think I said Michigan already. And as well as the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, where I disagree with some Sanders people. Now, a lot of Sanders people say, well, if it wasn't for the DNC and the rigging and, leaking the debate questions, Bernie would have won and beat Hillary Clinton. Now, cool your jets there. He would have done much better if they wouldn't have manipulated the primaries and Clinton hadn't done so many dirty deeds. If a lot of these things had been different, yes, it's possible he would have either done better or he would have won against her. Why I say that I doubt he would have won is because he really put almost no effort into winning in the South. And you can see on the map that the most southern states that he won, the southernmost states that he won, were Oklahoma, where the Democrats had virtually no chance of winning, and West Virginia, where, yes, he probably could have, possibly defeated Donald Trump. But you look across the rest of the southern states, and he was just destroyed. Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida. He was just wiped out everywhere in the South, completely destroyed by Hillary Clinton. So had he made it to the general election, there are a number of states that she had won that he would have had zero chance of winning. Which ones am I talking about? I'm talking about Virginia. I'm talking about, for example, Virginia would be the most obvious one. There would also probably have been Iowa. Iowa would have probably gone to Donald Trump as well. But all of these southern states would have fallen to Donald Trump. A number of the states that she would have, that she did win in the primary, would have never gone to Bernie Sanders either, that Hillary Clinton won. A good example, Nevada would not have voted for Bernie Sanders. I don't care what anybody says. Donald Trump would have destroyed her, and would have destroyed Bernie Sanders in Nevada. The New Hampshire, obviously, he would have won by a larger margin than Clinton did. But people are behaving as if he would have won the primary had it not been for the manipulation, all the primaries, that he would have just destroyed her. That's not true. There were a lot of things that she did that were just underhanded and dirty and whatever, but he did have his flaws in the campaign. And by not campaigning actively in the South, he certainly did not do himself any favors. There are a number of states, though, where he would have been much closer to beating Donald Trump. For example, in Pennsylvania, I think he would have won Pennsylvania. In all of those Midwestern states that he did well, for example, Michigan, I think he would have probably defeated Donald Trump in Michigan. He would have been seen as a change agent in a lot of those states. But we don't know how he would have. For example, you go to a state like New York, which granted is very liberal, but there's a massive financial sector in New York. How would they have reacted to Sanders fighting, going up against Trump in the general election? It's still a very good question. I think that Sanders would have had a little harder of a job defeating Donald Trump in New York than Hillary Clinton did, because Hillary Clinton, after all, was pretty popular in New York State. Say what you want about her. So essentially, what's the ultimate point of this? You can say whatever you want about whether Sanders would have defeated Trump, but what I think is really evident here is that it's not really possible to reform the Democratic Party from within. So with that being said, please comment on this video. Also, go to the link. There's a link to the article in the description, and read through it, and see whether you agree with something or not. Comment on the article itself. Please share the article, share the video, like the video, and subscribe to the channel, and share the video as well. And have a great Sunday.